Hello, my name is Ward Miller. I'm the Richard H. Driehaus Executive Director of Preservation Chicago, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. We are still working our way through a treasure trove of new architecture books. So guess what? Today we'll explore architectural pottery with Dan Chavkin, Jeffrey Head, and Jo Lauria. Sustainable houses with Penny Craswell, and visit the Queen of Architecture interviews, journalist and historian Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel. And now here's your host, the Crown Prince of Architecture interviews, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. But Crown Prince is overstating it a bit. Maybe the bishop? The knight?
The jester?
Some other minor chess piece?
Yeah.
We are at show 395. And in 5 weeks, we're coming up on 10 years and 400 shows. We're going to have a special show 400, special mostly because Tom is getting paid double for this one. There's so much editing to do.
There's a lot of archive work.
We're going to recap some of our finer moments, remembering the guests who have passed on, and bringing back some great guests all the way back to show number 1 in 2015. When the show got started that January, we taped for about 6 months and just couldn't get many listeners. So in the fall, it was over. Another failed podcast. And then at the end of the year, all the Architecture magazine best of lists came out, and U.S. Modernist Radio was on those lists, with top honors from both Dwell and Atomic Ranch. It was such a great surprise, and within a week, we were back in the studio full steam ahead. We didn't do a special episode for show 100 or 200, but show 300 featured a long, sought-after interview with architect Bjarke Ingels. That took about 2 years to arrange, and it was so worth it. This dude is as amazing and compelling in person as he is on YouTube, and his firm is one of the most innovative in the world. He's got that rare ability to persuade clients to adopt his creativity without being a diva about it, like, say, Frank Lloyd Wright. And he just turned 50. So we've got a lot more stunning projects to look forward to in the next 30 years or so. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Past podcast guest Dan Chavkin is an accomplished photographer and the author of Unseen Mid-Century Desert Modern, and also George's favorite architecture book, Star Trek: Designing the Final Frontier. Jeffrey Head is a writer and design historian. Jo Lauria is a curator and educator trained at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Together, they are the co-authors of Architectural Pottery, Ceramics for a Modern Landscape. It's a meticulously researched book that explores mid-20th century ceramic art and its relationship to the modernist houses we love. Here's George's conversation with Dan, Jeffrey, and Jo.
Jo, let's start with you. I understand that you played a crucial role in the PBS series Craft in America, which was a big deal. How did you get involved in that?
Well, my crucial role was about 10 to 15 years ago when Carol Sovian, who founded Craft in America, approached me to do an exhibition, a multi-venue exhibition, and a book that chronicled 200 years of objects handmade in America. That was an enormous project and required more than 7 writers to collaborate on different chapters in the book. For instance, Stephen Graff, who has a background in Indigenous arts, we asked him to write the chapter on how Indigenous artists have been making handmade materials, the entire existence of the United States. So then I consulted on one of the first programs they did. And as they got their sea legs, basically on their own, they have their producer, researchers, and a director. And they've been going on now for that 20 years. But that's how I got involved. So the first book they ever published, I was co-author with Stephen Fenton.
Now, have they asked you since then to come on and pitch for PBS and raise money at the fundraisers, shout out the number to call, that kind of thing?
No, the arrangement that Craft in America has with PBS is Craft in America is a separate entity and PBS is basically their distributor.
Okay.
So when Craft in America fundraises, it's for their own productions. That is mighty enough.
Yes. Now, Jeffrey, when I first saw this book, Architectural Pottery, I thought it was just like a generic title, like Architectural Pottery, sort of like kitchen knives, say. But Architectural Pottery was the name of a company, right?
That's right. The same company started another series of companies. The biggest one was after Architectural Pottery was Architectural Fiberglass, another sort of generic sounding company name or product.
And then they grouped 5 divisions under their company name of Group Artec in 1971.
Dan, who started Architectural Pottery?
That was the husband and wife, Max and Rita Lawrence. That was around, 1949 when they were sort of exposed to it by the great graphic designer Lou Danziger, because Max Lawrence, the husband, had an office near Lou's studio in LA. They became friendly and Lou informed Max about pottery that was being made at a school called the California School of Arts, in which the instructor, Legardo Tackett, who became one of the main designers of or for architectural pottery, was giving a class basically challenging the students to make a new kind of pottery.
And Jeffrey, what was the old kind of pottery at this point?
Well, it was garden variety. It was pretty much based on historical forms, historical shapes. There was a company here in the LA area called Italian Terracotta, and they made these very elaborate, highly decorative pots. And that was kind of what you would see in the stately mansions in this area. So they were, I wouldn't say they were aspirational, but they were quite visible, these, very large, ornate pots. And actually, the same company is the one that Tackett selected for his students to use for their own designs. So the students actually went to the Italian Terracotta Company and used the molds, modified the molds that the company was using for their pottery, for their elaborate designs. And the students stripped the molds of those cherubs and other decorative elements, and also cut and reformed the molds to come up with new shapes. So at the time, the shapes were really quite new and very modern before we would call them modern. There were still other companies making these sort of traditional garden pots, and many of these are well-known companies.
Jo, did this catch on right away? Was the company successful right out of the gate?
Well, if you mark success by being tapped to be in the Museum of Modern Art's Good Design Show, that is an unequivocal yes. In 1950, when the company was officially founded, it was with Rita and Max Lawrence in partnership with 2 of the designers who held the licensing for the designs of the pots, and that was John Follis and Rex Good. And Rita Lawrence took over the marketing of the company. Well, she took over everything, actually. She was the president, the marketer, the distributor, the genius behind the success of architectural pottery. And through either word of mouth or some brochures that she may have sent to the Museum of Modern Art, 3 of the architectural pottery examples were shown in that 1950-1951 Museum of Modern Art Good Design exhibition, and 3 of them were included in the catalog. And one of them was featured in a photo collage on the back of the catalog. So they were able to use that out of the gate promotion of their company. We have just been established and we've already been promoted by the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
Were there certain architects, Jo, that gravitated to this right away and made it a part of their recommendations to clients?
Well, I believe Welton Beckett was one of them, and Pierre Koenig, I would say, because in all of the Julius Shulman photographs of the case study houses, there is a wonderful placement of architectural pottery within the interior and exterior of the homes. So these were specified by these case study architects. And I think part of that also came through John Intenza, the publisher of Arts and Architecture, because he was very good friends, lifelong friends with Rita and Max Lawrence, and attended many of their salons they had in their house in Bel Air. That was a convocation of designers and architects. I'm sure that, relationships are everything in business, George, as you know. So that's why I think that they were prolific.
I would add Craig Elwood and Raphael Soriano to the list of architects who spec'd or incorporated architectural pottery into their projects.
As well as like Buff and Hensman.
Mm.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Julius Shulman himself had some hand in maybe publicizing it, including it in his very iconic photographs of these case study homes, particularly case study 22, the Stall House, which is featured in the book, that really shows quite a few examples of architectural pottery throughout the landscape of the house.
Were there joint ventures or collaborations with furniture manufacturers and architectural pottery?
So there was Van Keppel Green, right off, who included architectural pottery in their showroom and in their catalogs. So there was a collaboration between those two companies. Also, there were nurseries, plant nurseries, that had featured architectural pottery.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think that will be a great partnership.
And I believe Jerome and Evelyn Ackerman introduced architectural pottery to Paul McCobb. And according to Jerry Ackerman, they had architectural pottery in Paul McCobb's showroom in New York City. So that was a way to move the product from the West Coast to the East Coast, because I believe primarily the West Coast was much more attuned to the pottery.
Also, in speaking of Paul McCobb, I think that connection helped lead McCobb to design pots for architectural pottery. And there's some photographs of McCobb's, I guess it was a townhouse in Manhattan, that had his architectural pottery designs.
I noticed little things, just me being crazy. I noticed that the book has an unusual cover. It's this very, very thick cardboard, and it's sort of sliced around the edge. I assume that was a design decision. I'm interested to know what that's all about.
Yes, that was a design decision made by our designer, Gary Wexler.
Of Donald Wexler's fame, of his son.
Yes. And since I worked closely with Gary on the design of the book, he, in his library, had a book on the architect and designer Max Bill, published by another publisher, in which the binding was exactly the same, this cut solid cardboard. And it's something Gary really pushed for and wanted to do, and I loved it. And I thought it was unusual. And fortunately, in the end, the publisher agreed.
It's really unique and really quite lovely.
Thank you.
Well, it's also utilitarian for us because it allows the book to lay almost completely flat, so that, those wonderful images by Dan and vintage photographs as well that bleed over on 2 pages can be seen without being obscured in the gutters.
Dan, as you're taking photographs of the pottery, are there any tips you can give us amateurs out here about how to shoot these works? Because I assume it's a little different than shooting houses.
Yes, because, you're dealing with outdoor, you're dealing with a landscape, and you're dealing with these pots in, what we call in situation, which most of the photos that I made in the book represent. Not all. I did make some studio photographs as well. But back to your question, tips. Looking back, I didn't really have to move anything because fortunately, most of the situations I photographed were pretty well curated. Not to mention the pots themselves are heavy, and they're even heavier with plants inside them.
Oh, I bet.
So
A couple 100 pounds, I would assume.
yeah, and the owners of these pots really cherish and covet their collections. And I didn't want to risk damaging anything. So I didn't really do a lot of staging or moving, So I think it's a matter of looking at and taking in what is already existing and what's there, and then create a kind of composition around that, including the landscape, which is important. So you're creating this relationship between the pottery and the landscape and how they define each other.
Did you have to wait for a certain type of day, like a lot of people do for this, or was it something you could augment with lighting that you brought?
I augmented it with lighting. Yeah.
Now, I can't let Dan get away from an interview without asking a crossover question. So, Dan, was there any architectural pottery in Star Trek, the original series?
Yes, absolutely. To my surprise, I was very pleasantly surprised. And in fact, architectural pottery appears in 3 episodes, all of which are in season 1. I could break it down. The first one being the Corbomite maneuver.
Ah, wonderful. Yep.
With a little Clint Howard.
Clint Howard. Try the Tranya. It's delicious.
Yes. Exactly. And that's a Malcolm Leland lantern that was repurposed to be the command module of his ship.
Okay.
And the second one is an episode called The Man Trap. And that appears on the Enterprise nursery.
Okay.
And one of the planters is a John Follis designed what is called the tire planter. The shape looks like a tire. And the third being Taste of Armageddon, which features a David Cressy designed pot, a very unusual pot that Cressy designed. So yeah, 3 episodes.
Taste of Armageddon, was that the one with Frank Gorshin with the half black, half white fellows clashing on the bridge?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Very famous episode. We digress here, folks, because Dan and I are Star Trek fans, and there's a little element of architecture in a lot of Star Trek.
Yeah.
How can people use this book to improve their own homes and the way that they decorate for living?
Well, I think collectors can use the book specifically to determine the years and the designers of certain pieces that they may have collected. And the research was somewhat limited or entirely limited before the book was published. So this is a great resource for collectors, but they also can see, all the popular styles of the pots. And there were basically 12 primary designers who came up with their individual designs for architectural pottery. And they can now search out those pots on the various auction sites, or as some collectors say, in the wild, find them on people's porches and knock on their doors and ask to buy them. But they can identify, usually there's 2 camps of collectors. Those who collect the very streamlined, geometric, sharply profiled pots that are emblematic of Lagardo Tackett and Paul McCobb, and those who collect David Cressy sculptures, which are much more organic and also feature flame glazing, which is an overlapping of 2 or more glazes on the pot, so that they're very colorful.
Jeffrey, where can people find these pots now? Is Artec still going?
No, all of the companies associated with architectural pottery are long gone. So really all that remains are the originals. There are companies that have copied, knocked off, perhaps even you could say reissued. And then of course there's the secondary markets for these original pieces. It's aside from the prices, the pieces are out there. The pieces are available. They show up. Some of the shapes and the textures are more sought out than others. But the pieces are accessible. Aside from the cost, they are available.
And what are these costs? What's the price range of these now? If you find one on the secondary market,
the Cressy's, the David Cressy design pots are the ones that command the most amount of money. They can range anywhere from $4,000 to $13,000. The more traditional line of pots, say by Fallis or Leland or Tackett, I don't think you could find anything for less than 1,000. So it's 1,000 and up. And then if you go on First Dibs, and First Dibs has its own architectural pottery page, featuring all the pots by various dealers throughout the United States, well into the thousands, easily.
Much of this depends, of course, on the condition, the size, the shape, the texture. But for many people, that isn't such a concern or a driver, because I think there are many people who actually use the pots as they're intended for plants. So, if it has blemishes or a hairline crack, or for some of us, I'm speaking maybe perhaps more about myself, those things don't bother me. I know that there are collectors who are very specific, and understandably, after a certain type or a condition. But I think the range in the condition of pieces really helps to make the pieces more accessible.
The book is Architectural Pottery, Ceramics for a Modern Landscape. Thank you all for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was George with Dan Chavkin, Jeffrey Head, and Jo Lauria. Starting her career as an art critic, Penny Craswell is one of Australia's most influential voices in design. Her work as a writer, editor, and curator spans the world of interiors, architecture, and craft. She is the creator of the blog Design Writer and is the author of a new book published by Timms and Hudson, The New Sustainable House. George Smart spoke with Penny Craswell via Zoom.
Penny, I remember in the United States, 50-some odd years ago, we had this thing called the energy crisis. And people were very concerned about energy and the whole idea of what wasn't even called sustainability at the time was you would just do things and build things with less energy. And at that time, it was about saying using less heating oil or less coal or less electricity or gas or natural gas. It was all about this thing called energy efficiency. That was the big phrase that was being bandied about.
Yes.
So help take us from that time to now what sustainability means, because it's really expanded and changed from just the fuels we use to heat and air condition buildings.
Absolutely. So energy efficiency is a really important thing in architecture still, and it is a driving factor for a lot of sustainable design features in buildings. What I've discovered through writing this book and what people are realizing all over the world is that there are so many ways to be sustainable, that it's not just one thing. And I think when the publisher and I first started talking about this book, we had in mind a kind of off-grid house that used solar, that had water tanks and was off-grid. And that was what we were looking at.
The kind of isolationist approach to sustainability.
That's right. But you can't be isolationist. You have to be all-rounded in your view of what sustainability can be, because the materials used in buildings also need to be sustainable. And you need to also think about your carbon footprint in building a house. There's so many different aspects to sustainability now. And I think one of the things that I found is that there were new technologies that I'd never even heard of, or that people who are quite knowledgeable about sustainability have in one country have not heard of that is happening in other countries. For example, I did a talk last week in Sydney about this book, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said that she didn't think that geothermal heating was something that was possible at a residential level, but it is possible. It's just only happening in Amsterdam, or it is happening in Amsterdam at the moment, because I spoke to the architect who'd had it installed. So I think one of the things is to realize that new stuff is being developed all the time and that you have to have an open mind and be willing to learn, even if you are experienced in sustainable architecture, and not necessarily make assumptions that it would cost more necessarily. It might cost more. Not make assumptions that would limit your ability to actually investigate some of these opportunities.
Penny, one thing I'm curious about is this movement towards mass timber buildings, because, I don't know much about this. I always thought that if you cut down more trees, that was bad for the environment and the climate and sustainability. And now they're talking about building enormous buildings out of wood. So explain that for me.
Yeah, I think what it means to build a wooden building is changing, because it's not about cutting down old growth forest hardwoods and making them into buildings. The new timber that is being used in buildings is actually an engineered timber, which means that it is grown in sustainable plantations, and then the veneer is taken, often for cross-laminated timber, for example. The veneer is taken only 3 millimeters of timber is taken from the trunk of the tree, and then that is glued together crossways to create this incredibly hard timber that doesn't warp. And that is one of the new technologies. And the other thing about the engineered timbers is that they can be treated so that they are not a fire hazard. So that's the kind of timber that people are using, and that's making a difference with sustainable design.
So there are tree farms that are doing this kind of thing with slicing off sections of the tree slowly over time. That's amazing. I'd never heard of this.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you can literally put in an order for a house. I spoke to an architect in Amsterdam who wanted to build a house using cross-laminated timber, and it's a prefabricated system. So basically, he gave them the measurements for the house that he wanted in Latvia, and they build a house for him, and it comes in pieces, and you build it on site like a flat pack, like IKEA. It's an incredible technology, and there's no waste, because when you build with wood on a regular building site, all the offcuts of the timber get thrown away, and that's, a valuable resource that is new that we're throwing in the bin, in the landfill. So this is an incredible thing. And the other thing about cross-laminated timber, when used in this way as a structural building element, is that you don't have to add an extra finish on the interiors. So you may want to add cladding on the outside and a roof, but you don't need to finish the interiors. So that's even reducing the amount of materials that you need to finish the house.
So this wood of mass timber buildings is not the wood like I think of with my grandfather, where I go to the store and I buy a 2x4 and I make it into something. This is a whole technological process.
That's right. And there's another version which is called SIPS, S-I-P-S, Structural Insulated Panel System. And that's made of an insulated core. And then on both sides sandwiched, the insulation is sandwiched in the middle, and it has 2 faces of timber, which is oriented strand board timber. So that's another example of a prefabricated material solution that you can bring to site and have it pre-cut to the right size and then slotted in place. So there's fantastic technologies happening.
In Austin, Texas, this past year, we had the opening of the first 3D printed neighborhood. So is 3D printing coming about globally as a technology, and is that a sustainable way of making houses, for instance?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting new technology. It has been slow to be taken up in the residential house sector. I looked for 3D printed housing for this book, but I couldn't find anything that was finished. There were a few projects that were still in progress. I think the question about whether it's sustainable, because it's a new technology and it's very interesting, but the question is it actually made of a material that is in some way better for the environment. So that is, there's less waste, or there's an easier way to recycle it at the end of life, or it's made of a material that's recycled or a biomaterial of some sort. I think a lot of them are 3D printed concrete, and concrete is not the best material in terms of sustainability because it goes in landfill at the end.
Right. It seems like that's the boogeyman right now, is concrete and steel are bad and wood is good. I was wondering if there's any other 3D materials other than concrete. Because, when you watch the videos of them printing these houses, it looks like they're squeezing out toothpaste, on this giant tube. Are they making this paste out of anything besides concrete that you know of?
Not with 3D printing that I know of, although I'm sure there's somebody working on that right now. But there is concrete that comes with, hempcrete, for example. There's a couple of projects in the book that are made of hempcrete, which is using hemp as the fibrous material to strengthen concrete or to fill in concrete. There's also concrete that has fly ash, which is a byproduct of the coal industry. So you're taking a byproduct that would normally go to landfill and using that in your concrete. So there are ways to make concrete more sustainable, and concrete has the benefit of adding a lot of thermal mass to a building, so it can really help with heating and cooling. It's just not the best material.
Okay. Well, fair enough. One of the things I like in your book is you've got these beautiful examples of homes and buildings all around the world, really. Did you get to visit most of these?
Oh, I wish. This book was written over a kind of 6 to 12 month period, depending whether you count getting all the permissions from the architects. And so it would have been impossible to visit them all. I visited a few in Australia, but I haven't been overseas for a few years. So maybe the next book I'll be able to visit more.
Tell me about one of the houses you visited in Australia, and what was that like?
In Melbourne, there's a fantastic house actually built by and designed by 2 German architects who've been living in Melbourne for about 20 years, a couple. And they found a piece of unused site next to a train track. And they sort of cheese-shaped wedge of a site, and they decided they wanted to do something with it and build their own family home. So because they're sustainable architects, they decided we're going to put every single sustainable thing that we can think of in this house. So it is an incredible house. When you visit, you walk down this little lane past another house and you think, where am I going? I visited on a day when it was really cold and windy. And when I was led inside, the room temperature was so beautiful and warm, but not stuffy, with fresh air. So this is a passive house. It's a prefabricated house. It's made with cross-laminated timber. It's got shosugiban facade, which means that it's charred with fire, which is a Japanese method of finishing a facade of a house or other building. And that protects it against mold and insects and fire, amazingly. The experience of walking into this house is all that you really need to understand why sustainable architecture is incredible, because the ambient temperature all year round is around 20 degrees. There's a heat recovery ventilation system that keeps the air fresh inside. They also did all sorts of things outside, including aquaponics and a fish pond. And the manure from the fish feeds the vegetable garden. And there's so many systems in this house. And it was just beautiful to visit and to see all of these things that I'd been writing about in practice in a family home.
That's wonderful. Who are these architects?
Mark and Felicity from Melbourne Design Studios.
Okay.
And the house is called Hut, number 1 passive house. Basically, they created this as a template that could be used all across Australia. So they want to bring sustainable architecture to Australia. And this is one design out of a number of designs that they've got in a drawer that they plan to help Australians to become more sustainable in their building.
So now that you've written this book, do you want to build a sustainable house?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about getting that idea of sustainability into your head in everything you do in life. And last year we had our front fence knocked down and replaced because it had been sort of ruined by a huge tree that had made it sort of half fall over. And it was only as they were knocking it down and putting the bricks into the skip and getting the new bricks out that I realized I should have asked for recycled bricks.
Ah, yes.
So I think it's a lesson because everything you do might be made more sustainable. And even at the level of getting your front fence replaced, you have to, or you don't have to, but it could be useful and beneficial to think about a sustainable way of doing it. You know, I'd love to build a house, but I don't think that's really on my to-do list yet.
Yes. What's happening in terms of other kinds of technologies? Has solar power taken hold in Australia?
Absolutely. I think in some of the more emerging countries, solar is starting to gain traction. For example, there are incentives in India at the moment for people to get solar. I do think that in some of the cases, people said that they were going to install solar, but then they realized that there was renewable energy already through the system. And so that would mean that you're getting solar panels that at the end of life you have to dispose of. So sometimes it can be better not to have solar if the system is already renewable. So that's interesting.
Right, right. And how is nuclear going these days? I mean, we had the big backlash of nuclear in the 80s and 90s, but it seems to be embracing more by countries around the world who figured out how to do it more safely.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an alternative to coal, it's definitely could be beneficial. I think where you can use sun and wind, though, I'm not sure whether it's more beneficial than those things which are already existing. The sun always shines, the wind always blows, and if you can create technologies to capture those things, I think that's going to be beneficial.
I've read there are technologies now to use low-level radioactive products, not uranium or plutonium, but elements like thorium,
Wow.
which you can build small reactors out of that are not as dangerous as their big counterparts.
Wow.
And this is being worked on in Norway.
Oh, I haven't heard that one. That's fascinating.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
For the average homeowner in the United States, what are your recommendations for how we can be more sustainable in our lives? What are some things that we could do in the next month or two to improve our sustainability?
One of the things that is important is the mindset. And I've already talked a little bit about that when you might be renovating. But I think things like using less, reusing things more. I was looking the other day at a website and there was a woman saying, don't we all just get out the same Christmas decorations every year and put them out? What's this idea that we have to have a different color theme every year and buy all new decorations every single year? And that's true. You know, there's no reason to have all of a sudden this year have a blue Christmas tree. It's quite nice to have the same decorations every year that kind of get brought out and you remember fondly, especially if they're handmade or they have a nice, personal connection or you bought them somewhere special. And I also think that not being afraid to have a small home or a small amount of materials, whatever that is. When I was talking to the publisher about the different sustainable features in the book, I said one of them was small. And the publishers had a meeting and they said, small? That's not really a sustainable feature. But it can be incredibly powerful. If you have a couple living in a giant house, deciding to relocate to a small house or to an apartment that uses a lot less energy, that uses a lot less material to build, that can have a huge impact on the environment.
Absolutely. And the value of architects and architecture is because they know more about scale and structure and space than you do. They can design a house that can be small but also live large.
That's right. And pack a lot of function into a small amount of space. Make sure that you have enough space for you to work at home, for example, or for you to have your 20-person family over for Sunday dinner or whatever it is that you like to do by having flexible spaces. Even something as simple as having some stackable chairs or stools for when family come that you can then put away in a corner somewhere or in the laundry or somewhere. That kind of thing can make a big difference to not needing vast amounts of space.
The book is The New Sustainable House. Penny, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much, George.
Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel is a pioneering cultural preservationist, author, and former White House assistant, known for her tireless work in safeguarding America's architectural heritage. She was New York City's longest-serving Landmarks Preservation Commissioner. Barbaralee is a prolific writer. She has authored 24 books, including The Landmarks of New York, and she served on numerous influential boards, including the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Battle Monuments Commission. During the 70s and 80s, before podcasts, before YouTube, before the internet, she interviewed hundreds of artists, musicians, architects, designers, photographers, directors, actors, writers, and art collectors, creating an incredible body of work available online at YouTube and in person at Duke University. Here is George's conversation with Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel.
Barbaralee, I have been fascinated by your history and looking up all the things that you have done. One thing I didn't know about you before today is that you were part of the Kennedy administration. You must be one of the last surviving members of that administration.
Well, it was really more of a Johnson administration.
But you were there, what, in 62?
No, 63.
63, okay.
But it was really Lyndon Johnson's election and administration. And I did something that I hope is of interest to you.
What's that?
And that was the first and only White House Festival of the Arts. I did that in 1965, and every discipline was represented by some of the most magnificent minds around, and the wonderful creative community, from the visual arts to the literary arts, architecture, poetry, photography, and so on. So throughout the entire White House and out of doors, and then there was a big dinner. But it also had a sidebar.
I have to assume, Barbaralee, that in 1964, you attended the New York World's Fair, didn't you?
I did, but not in an official way.
Right, but you attended it, and that was all about the future, and the future was going to be great and bright. And we were going to have flying cars and two-way wrist TVs and these incredible inventions.
Well, we did get some of them.
Yes, we did. We got the two-way wrist TVs, at least.
Yes.
How was it to go to that World's Fair?
It was quite wonderful. And, of course, I am very happy about the repurposing, as I noticed the most recent Olympics finally took in mind the public realm and enduring additions to the communities that they are meant to serve. And I think that is a great improvement, rather than these one-time uses that become moribund and more of a problem than an asset. So I think Paris did a very good job of that.
Yes, they're getting quite a lot of accolades for that,
and they deserve it.
And also for the reuse of the facilities post-Olympics, which is always promised but rarely happens.
That and the overbearing traffic problems and the use of some of their greatest monuments as fora for a lot of athletic events is extraordinary.
How did you start interviewing architects and designers? because you've done hundreds of interviews and there are many more documents, all of these that we're mentioning being stored at Duke University. How did you get started with those interviews?
Well, I've worked for a lot of newspapers and magazines, and I interviewed people for background or content or profiles. And one of the persons that I interviewed actually surprised me when he said, this is a wonderful idea. You should videotape them and keep them for history. Well, I said, that is a very clever idea, and went on my way. But maybe one day in a traffic jam, which I try to use to focus on ideas rather than be harassed by being late somewhere, I started to think about his idea, and I decided I would try that and asked if he would be a part of it, and he said, of course. As it turned out, he was so enthusiastic about it, he provided not one, not two, but 3 exhibitions at his then premier art gallery. Now you must guess who it was who came up with that creative idea.
Okay. I'll take Larry Gagosian for 100.
Well, Larry Gagosian might have said that now, but we're going back lots of years. He runs a very creative gallery and its flanker product, so to speak. But he was probably still in California then. The person was the one and only Leo Castelli.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And interestingly enough, I asked Massimo Vignelli, did you ever interview that wonderful man?
I didn't get a chance to talk with him, no.
That's too bad, because you missed a really dynamic personality who was one of the great designers of the day, as you know. And if you don't believe me, ask Michael Beirut, who is one of the great designers of this day, who always talks about Massimo and the 10 years he spent working with him. So Massimo designed the exhibits, and the exhibits were photographs that took place during each interview with sound in all of the rooms. So it was really quite remarkable that he paid so much attention to it, and clearly it was of some interest and value to him because there were 3 different exhibits, and Massimo designed them all. He was really a very creative and cultivated man, in addition to being a great eye and tastemaker.
When I look at all the people that you did interview, let me just reel off a couple of names. You talked with Louise Nevelson several times, Philip Johnson, Bill Blass, Jim Polchek, I.M. Pei, Michael Graves, Lisa Taylor, Cesar Pelli, Edward Larrabee Barnes, Charlie Gwathmey, Ronaldo Garjola, Charles Moore, Brendan Gill, Thomas Hess. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Ivan Shermayev. I mean, wow, what incredible conversations.
Well, they continue. Unfortunately, they now continue in a different guise. I'm not certain that you are aware of a program that I invented actually about 30 years ago called Notable New Yorkers.
Okay.
And I have long been committed to the idea, as much as I am committed to the preservation of the best of the public realm, that what really counts is what goes on within those structures. So it honors those people who lived and worked and played in New York and made a significant contribution. And I need not tell you that they are what makes this the dynamic city that it continues to be to this day. Would you like to know who some of the recent ones are?
I would.
Harry Belafonte, who turned out to be, besides all the contributions that the public are aware of, his life was really central to the civil rights movement, and he lived in an apartment building and had 2 floors, and everyone stayed there, including Martin Luther King, over and over and over again. And he was a very central figure to that. There is a story that he had a Caucasian wife who was Jewish, and they applied for an apartment in this building and were rejected. I can't attest to whatever the reason was, but I do know they were rejected. Several years later, he called up a number of his friends and suggested they buy the building.
Ah.
And indeed they did. And among other things, he gave 2 apartments away. The penthouse to Lena Horne.
Okay.
Wasn't that a good choice?
Oh, yes.
And a lower level one to a man who was still alive a year ago, who was a very noted musician, but a musician's musician, and he was then about 90. He didn't even know him, but he knew of his work. So I can't, forget facts like that. Walter Cronkite was a recent one. Let me see who else. Stephen Sondheim was a memorable one because a lot of performers were the interviewees, and one of them who certainly was the hero of the year, Jonathan Groff, was in Merrily We Roll Along, that at the time of its production, it was one of the few flops, so to speak,
Yes.
of Sondheim, and it became, the last several years, sort of the hottest ticket in town, with no small credit going to this very gifted, attractive, open converser, Groff, who was about to appear in a musical as the lead as well.
And he was in Hamilton, I believe.
Yes, he was George III. You
Right.
had the right fellow. And he is about to be a musical figure. Hannah Arendt, which was more timely than I wish it were, with, again, very significant scholars about her very compelling life and contribution. The one that I'm working on now might interest you.
Okay.
His career was venerated, but also not without controversy because of the subject matters. And his name is Edward Albee.
All right, sure.
And Edward, someone that I knew for years, was one of the most gentle of men who had a very complex life, but was very devoted not only to writers, but painters and musicians, and has a foundation that, of course, still exists and provides residence for gifted people in various art fields. So we have 146 of them now, and they're in all 5 boroughs. And what gave me the impetus is I was visiting a very significant country house of a prominent Brit, and there was a tile in the library. It had a little label, and it said, "From the Apthorpe in New York," and it gave all the information, reinforcing my resolve. If buildings are going to be saved or preserved in New York, they should better stay in New York, and we'd better be more vigilant about it.
Well, let's use that moment to talk about your new book. It's called Beyond Architecture, The New New York. And you are the editor of this book, which has a beautiful cover and back cover, which is a map of the neighborhoods in New York, which I love. It's wonderful graphics, Barbaralee.
Thank you. I am not modest about this at all, because it was such a delight. It's the first book that I've designed from cover to cover. The end papers are maps as well, because the maps tell part of the story of the new New York. And I have written a chapter describing why I asked some of the most significant and creative architects, critics, landscape architects, historians, engineers, scholars, just critical thinkers, to tell us what they would like to write about for the 60th anniversary of the passage of the New York City Landmarks Law. It's hard to believe it's 60 years old, and while it is the most influential landmarks law and landmarks commission by the nature of what it oversees, and that's more than 38,000 properties, but it's also the smallest agency in New York. So while there may be disagreements that one has with evaluations, they play a critical role valiantly over a 60-year period. And I have been the chair of the commemoration from the very first, which was in 1980, its 15th anniversary, and we've done it every decade since, and sometimes in between. And I always feel if I ask other people to do something, I'd best do something myself. And often I will do exhibits or lecture series. But I decided that as I was contemplating what would engage me as well as an audience, I came up with the idea of the essays because, for about 35 years, the Diamonstein-Spielvogel PEN America Prize for the corpus of the work of the writer has been awarded to some of the most significant essayists. I think of it as an art form that is especially difficult. And for me, it is reminiscent of watercolors or painting, particularly drawings.
The Landmarks Commission is 60 years old. Were there certain events that caused them to be created? Was there any connection, for example, to the demolition of Penn Station?
You're on the right track, but believe it or not, Penn Station is still an issue, and we hope there will be a resolution in the coming months. Robert Wagner was the mayor, and both his wife and a lot of her cohorts were very interested in opera. This is the story that I've always heard, and I accept it because I always think there is a human dimension that prompts people to be responsive both positively and negatively. And they were very involved with the Metropolitan Opera as well. They should have been an art form that encompasses music, voice, dance, sets, costumes, everything, the pageantry. The interior of the old Metropolitan Opera was meant to be pitch perfect. Its exterior was very ugly. I think on 37th Street, I don't recall personally its recollection, and it was demolished. There was a great hue and cry and a lot of pressure on the mayor before that and during that. There were a number of committed citizens committed to a rich and full opportunity for its residents and visitors. Well, I think those pressures went on for quite a long while. And then there were several men who were involved in the law that helped structure something, and Robert Wagner signed it.
And so this was the creation in, 64?
65.
65.
Actually, it was signed but then enabled by 65. It took a year to enable it.
As you look back at what the Landmarks Commission has accomplished, what are some of the buildings you think would no longer be around unless they were involved?
Oh, I'm not going to do that. It's like, who's your favorite child? I can't do that. But what I prefer to focus on is the astonishing factor that there are 157 historic districts. And those encompass not only designated landmarks, but the neighborhood. For example, what I am working on now for Edward Albee, and I recall visiting him many times in a building that wasn't an historic district, but has since become not only a very significant one, a very trendy one. It's called the Cast Iron District.
Okay.
And it is Lower Manhattan. He had the top 2 floors of this little small factory building, and the elevator, you had to run it yourself by a huge rope left over from its factory days. In the interim, they have a real elevator, and it is a coveted building. But there are columns outside that are cast iron. And I, who have created so many aspects of the landmarks law, could never affix something by violating the cast iron structure. So we've just spent several weeks with a very professional, approved installer who will find adhesives to affix this so that the fabric of the building is not disturbed. It's very serious, this historic district. We also have signage as demarcation of every district. And in the early days, I was the longest term commissioner for 17 years. But the meetings would last very, very late into the night. And I mostly rejected those soggy tuna fish sandwiches were offered. So one was fatigued and hungry by the time you had to leave. The most frequent testimony were about violations. And person after person would say, oh, I didn't know I lived in an historic district. Always lack of information. Well, I was very tired of A, fatigued, and B, staying there so late. And I decided one night while I was sitting there must be some way to inform them. Well, I am not a doodler, but I am a note taker. And I came up with an idea that I'm really very proud of. Every historic district in New York has a different color sign. And it says on the top, for example, Upper East Side Historic District, and then the design. I asked a friend, again, Massimo, of course, would he help me design a street sign? Of course, we did this and decided on a color, what would be most compatible with the variety of fabrics used throughout New York. Brick, glass, steel, limestone, brownstone. And we came up with a deep terracotta color and modernist, I would say, black and white print.
This was introduced in 1989.
How did you know that?
I looked it up.
Oh, good for you. And in any case, good for the city, too.
You're a young woman with a lot of promise, Barbaralee. What's next on your project list?
Well, first I have to launch this book, this wonderful book called Beyond Architecture, The New New York, and why you like those maps that are very cleverly done by a bunch of wonderful map makers at the New York Times with whom I negotiated to adapt these. Because now we have little Haiti, little Venezuela, you name it, because we are a city of about 8.4 million people with many neighborhoods and enclaves since the beginning of great immigration in about the 1880s, probably, have areas of primary location, and most people settle in areas where people from whence they came. I have been very active with a foundation, including a tenure that I now have with City University, the largest public university in the United States, and it is free of charge. And that, of course, means a great deal to me and the students that attend. It grants 50,000 degrees a year.
Barbaralee, thank you.
Thank you.
George Smart was chatting with Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel. Her newest book is Beyond Architecture, The New New York, available now.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger. And by Diane Bald and the Bubman family, restoring significant architecture in Malibu, Los Angeles, Toronto, and Palm Springs.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Accurate is her middle name, or it could be Agatha. We really don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another fresh from the printing press edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.